Good afternoon, class. Today we have one of my longtime friends, Mr. Trevor Jenkins, and he will be our subject matter in Black social capital today. Hi, Trevor. How are you?
Miss Bass, how you doing? We go way, way, way back to what, junior high?
Seventh grade?
Totally. I'm just so excited that I get to be a part of this. I get to talk to your class, and y'all have an amazing teacher, like a loyal, amazing teacher and friend. And so be grateful for her leadership because I've been blessed by it.
Would you like to introduce yourself to my students?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Trevor Jenkins. I'm the Senior Diversity, Inclusion, Belonging Manager at a Fortune 1000 company called ServiceNow. It's a tech company. It's about a cloud-based tech company, really focusing on automation and creating workflows for enterprises. We probably have 1,000 customers who pay us $1 million a piece. And so we really work with enterprise brands. But particularly my role, I get to work really about creating culture within the organization and creating inclusive mindsets, policies, and practices to ensure that there's equity in the workplace, that the ball of opportunities being distributed equally to different identities. I like to consider myself a point guard. Point guard really passes the ball and distributes opportunity to the other players. And so when I think about diversity, inclusion, belonging, I think it's our job to distribute different opportunity to different departments and individuals and identities in the workplace to ensure an equitable workplace.
All right, so starting with your current role, we're going to I'll start with the questions based on your current role at ServiceNow. And then we have some questions about unfiltered conversations, your pastoral background, as well as financial literacy. The first question based on your current role, how has social capital helped you achieve your position as senior manager and discovering your own business?
That's a really good question. I often say Dr. Seuss says, when you're looking for something, you got to eliminate all the places it can't be until you find the place it will be, right? And so I've actually dabbed in a lot of different things. And but when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it really started for me when I was in high school. If I can just go back a little bit, I met Lauren in junior high, Miss Bass, excuse me. And then we went to Southwest High School, and I was playing on the football team. And then you may not know this, or she may not want me to share this, but her father was the football coach of our team. And so they actually transferred to another part of Georgia. We lived in the state of Georgia. And so I ended up transferring to another high school. And this high school was really a prestigious high school in the city of Macon, Georgia. In the high school that I went from, which me and Lauren went together, was a great school, but there were socioeconomic differences for sure. And when I transferred to this school, it was just night and day. I often say, for the first time, I really questioned my social identity. I would question why God made me Black, because it seemed like everyone who had the opportunity at the school looked different than me. And so representation matters. I was one of 7 African Americans in the whole school. And so when I looked at the Scholastic magazines, I didn't see anyone who looked like me. When my friends were getting offer letters to college, I didn't see anyone who looked like me. And in the summertime, when there was vacations happening, many of my friends would go to their second homes. And I didn't know any person of color who had a second home. And so I found myself really frustrated and resentful in high school of why I was created Black, because it seemed like everyone who had the opportunity looked more white than me. Until I met a woman named Robin Stewart, one of my close friends to this day. She was my sophomore English teacher, and one of the first white Americans I ever met who knew more African American history than any African American I knew at the time. She actually studied it and dedicated her life to teaching majority culture about the contributions of people of color. And she introduced me to Harlem Renaissance writers. Now, my parents read African literature, but to another depth. She introduced me in African literature, Chinua Achebe. And in her classroom, I felt like I could be anything I wanted to be. And she taught me a valuable lesson. She taught me that everyone who looks like me is not always for me, and everyone who doesn't look like me is not always against me. And it really shook my world and my paradigm on bias, that I also can have a bias too. And it really helped me think about allyship. And allyship is not about how I see you, it's about how you want to be seen and how your identity wants us to show up. And so when it came to diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was really a passion of mine. It just started as me trying to pursue something that I was trying to figure out with my own personal life, that I was struggling. It was a pain point. And I've been fortunate to turn that pain point into profit and to be paid for the things that I'm particularly passionate about. And I think a lot of times we always chase the money, but I always say chase your purpose, chase your purpose, and you can profit off your pain in a positive way, where you can help other people honestly bridge the gap for them and understand their own journey in life and still get paid for it.
Awesome. Okay. Now on the financial tip, why do you think it's a high level of financial inequality among minorities?
That's a really good question. Lauren, have you ever, or Miss Bass, I keep calling you Lauren, Miss
Okay.
Bass. Have you ever played Monopoly?
Yes.
Right. The objective of Monopoly is what, right? To buy the board.
Yeah, buy as many properties as you can.
100%. And when someone passes or touches your property, what they have to do?
They owe you money.
They owe you money. And I think when you think the historic landscape of America, if America was a monopoly board, let's say, and this is historic, this is not anything derogatory to anyone, but white Americans were able to play on the board, right? And the reality, historically, it wasn't until the 1960s with the civil rights movement where people of color were actually able to play. So if you think about the history of the United States in the early 1600s, just say that you have a 200-year on-ramp of playing the game and accumulating property on the board. And then you say, hey, a person says, can I play? You say, no, you have to be a citizen. Well, how do you become a citizen? You have to be white, so I can't play. Or can you play? No, you have to be able to vote. Well, how do you be able to vote? Well, you have to be white. Or, you have all these stipulations for players not to be able to play. And then finally, in the 1960s, they say you're able to play. Well, the board is already taken up already. And so when you do play, anytime you jump on someone else's property, what you have to do?
You owe them.
You owe them. And I think right now, when you look at many neighborhoods of color, many people of color don't even own their own homes, right? And that's not a derogatory thing or a slight on people of color. It's just that there's been a system that it was created for certain people to thrive and other people to survive. And when you think about historically, even with the Native Americans, and we think about manifest destiny from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast and building the transcontinental train station, we were able to take Native Americans' land away from them and say, hey, we're going to put you on a little section on this board called these reservations. You can do whatever you want on this board in this little section, but you can't move away from there, right? Again, we were all able to do that through legislation and through policy, which made it illegal to steal from people. And so when we think about the racial inequities, a lot of times people see racial inequity as personal racism. I did something bad to you, but it's actually institutional and systemic, meaning that there was legislation and policy enforcing these behaviors for more than 400 years.
Yeah. Okay. I love your analogy with Monopoly. Like, okay,
Yes.
this is why you make the big bucks.
I wish. Pay the big taxes too. Get a good tax person too, FYI.
Have you found it difficult sometimes trying to educate Black people on financial literacy?
Absolutely. In younger African Americans or Black individuals, I think, when you live life long enough, you realize that there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is just consuming information, but wisdom is really knowing to do with the information that you've consumed, right? You have a lot of people who are knowledgeable, but they don't know what to do with the information. And we live in an era of every young person wants to have that self-made story, right? I started from the bottom, now I'm here, or I went independent, I did it on my own. You hear that in all the music, and that really shapes our mentality. But the reality is, you can solve a puzzle faster with people than by yourself. And so we need community. We need people around us to help us get to our destination faster. Now, part of that is, there's a lot of great solid families in the Black community, a lot of great dads, a lot of great moms, a lot of great grandmoms. Yet there are also many individuals who've experienced challenges of single parent homes, dad's not around, mom's not around, or grandma really took care of us, grandma loved us, but grandma didn't know how to make money, right? And so I always say is wherever there's a gap in your life, you have to do your due diligence to find someone to fill that gap in a sense. And so mentorship is very, very important for me. When I think about my own professional career, I remember when I got out of college, I went to college, right? And everyone does have that opportunity. My dad was in the post office for 39 years. My mom was a housewife. She took care of us. She raised us. And I remember going to college. And when I graduated from college, I had an opportunity to play with Philadelphia Eagles. Then I got cut. My first job was I interviewed for assistant store manager at Aldi's. And I remember I gave her my application. We were having an interview, and this African-American woman was interviewing me. And after the end of the interview, she looked at me and she said, Trevor, your resume is so great. You played at NFL, you have great grades, all these things. Why didn't you interview for the corporate side? And my heart dropped because I didn't know there was a corporate side. None of my family ever had a corporate job. And so I didn't really know the right questions to ask. And so I think exposure is very, very important. And I think there's a lot of honor in the work that my parents did. And I'm so thankful. They taught me such a lot, but there was a lot of access they didn't have. And so since that situation, I always say, if anyone's doing something I want to do that I don't have the knowledge of, best believe I'm going to be right by their side. And so I will invite people to coffee. I will build relationships with people. I'm trying to build that mental Rolodex of connections to help me get access to the things I don't have access to, not in a selfish way, but in a genuine way, because I want to help people help me. The people who help me, I want to help others along the way.
I thoroughly believe in informational interviews. I know in my career, when I kind of find out about a role that I wasn't aware of, or I start learning about other opportunities that I could be eligible for in the future, I find people who have those roles and I reach out via email, or I'll call them and ask, hey, can I have an hour of your time? Just to kind of talk to you about what you do. And I truly find it a great opportunity. Like, many people take me up on the opportunity to tell me about themselves. One, because people like talking about themselves, but two, it is me being genuine of, I think I could try to get where you are, or I think what you're doing is interesting. I want to learn more so I can see if I will be a good fit for something like that in the future. So I definitely love the fact that you reach out to people, and that's part of networking. And I think that's a part of the Black cultural experience that many of us are not aware of, how to conduct informational interviews, the value of networking, how to network. Sometimes you do have to get out of your comfort zone and reach out to people and just shoot your shot.
100%. We built the zoo, the movie 20 Seconds of Courage Can Change Everything, and literally 20 seconds can change everything. Asking someone to a cup of coffee, to lunch. And as they add value to your life, find ways how you can add value to their life too. Make it a mutually beneficial thing.
Awesome. What would you recommend someone once they reach $10,000 in their savings account?
It's all different based on your 3 to 6 months expenses, right? And so, but if you reach $10,000 in your saving account, when I think about a financial plan, I think about 4 wheels of a car. The first back wheel is your 6 months of expenses. I think a lot of times people don't have at least $1,000 in a savings account. So if you got to that point, congratulations to you. The second thing is what I consider 401k. If you have a job, or if your job matches any of your money, even if you don't have a job that has a 401k, there's ETFs in stocks where they're like 401ks. The 401k basically is your company matches any contribution that you put into, but the money is in a mutual fund, and that mutual fund is mirroring the S&P 500. And so the S&P 500 ultimately is saying, hey, over the last 30 years, it has given a return of 10% on your money. And so we can bet over a 30-year time frame that $10,000, there would be a 10% increase over that. each year over a 30-year time, which is a lot of money. So the second thing is, if your job offers a 401k, jump into it, contribute to it, or start investing in the S&P 500. Keep going or no?
Yeah.
The third thing is purchase land or a piece of real estate. I always say that God's making more people, but he's not making more land, right? And there's things that appreciate over time. For instance, I just purchased my house in September 1st, and I got a letter in the mail said that it had appreciated, which means that it gained an income, a value, an additional $7,000 in 6 months, right? I didn't do anything to it. I just brought it. And there's something called TMV, time value of money. And so the reality is $1 today is not worth the same tomorrow. It could be more, it could be less.
Sure.
And typically in real estate, over time, that it appreciates, it goes up. And so if I were you, if you have an ability, if you have good credit, or you have someone who will co-sign for you, get a piece of land or get a piece of real estate. You got to live somewhere. You got to sleep somewhere. So you might as well build equity into your own self. The fourth thing is I think some things that people don't take in consideration is get life insurance. And what life insurance says is every human being is valuable. But the reality is with life insurance, it says you're more valuable dead than alive. And what that means is anybody for $25 a month can get a policy that insures up to $100,000 or $200,000. And so many of us have experienced when a loved one dies, many of them didn't have life insurance. And so we got to go on GoFundMe to bury our loved one, right? But for a mere $25, right? Many of us got a great pair of shoes. We're on Amazon Prime. There's so many opportunities to save up $25 in a month. And worst case scenario, I don't wish this on anyone, but the worst case scenario, I know that my family wouldn't have to take on a burden of me, that I would leave my family $500,000. And the reason why that's important is oftentimes when you experience loss, there's depression and grief, and you don't want to work when you're depressed and you're in grief. And so the average income for a person to live on comfortably is $50,000. And so again, you break that $50,000, that $500,000 each year, that gives you 10 years of not having to work if you didn't want to. That you can live off that $500,000 for 10 years, not having to work as you navigate through your grief. And so that's the importance of these things, as you continue to live your life. These things are protectors for you when catastrophes happen.
Awesome. All right, so let's talk about your experiences as a pastor. What was your first job experience working with multi-ethnic faith-based communities?
It was a challenge. It really was a challenge. And I think because at the end of the day, I often talk about covering. Covering is basically aspects of our identity that we feel like we have to cover. They put us in a disadvantage or a threat. And oftentimes, a lot of times as African Americans or people of color, there's a lot of aspects of our culture that we cover, that we hide, that we don't bring into the workplace because we feel like it's going to be held against us. So we code switch, or we talk a certain way, or multiple ways, right? And so when you're having real authentic relationships in community, I encourage my people not to cover.
Mm.
And so when people are not covering and they're being their real authentic selves, now you have two different cultures clashing with one another. Because really, everyone doesn't think they're racist, and they say that. But racism is not exposed until you have two unique systems of power in the same room together. Because racism is all about power dynamics. And so when we got those two unique power dynamics, well, everyone has their own preferences of music. Everyone has their own preferences of style of communication. Everyone has their own preferences of what racism is and the historic history around those things and the narrative that we've been taught. And so it really became challenging to help educate people saying, hey, your way is not the only way of doing something. And so there's some things that we want to celebrate in this community, but there's some things that we're going to have to unlearn together. And one of the privileges I had was to pastor in a unique situation. It was in Memphis and Fraser. Majority in Fraser, the context about that community was it was majority white into the 80s. And then the factories were being built. And so they were being built in the suburbs. So there was a huge mass of white flight that went from the city downtown into the suburb. But there was a remnant of many white homeowners who owned their houses and didn't want to leave because it takes forever to pay off a house. And so as the African Americans were migrating into this area, it naturally became diverse, but it was forced diversity, if that makes sense. And so white flight happens when 10% of a minority culture enters into a white community. And the reverse is gentrification. And that happens when 10% of the majority culture enters into a minority neighborhood and they start buying up the property, start building the coffee shops and all these different things like that. And so initially when it happened, white flight happened. But when I came into the neighborhood, gentrification was starting to happen. And so there became these challenges there. But it was a really, really beautiful thing to kind of help these individuals zoom out and talk about the history of Memphis, to talk about the history of the US, and how did we get here when it came to racism and racial inequality, and what can we do moving forward to be better neighbors to one another?
I will be honest, I am definitely a code switcher. And I think it's actually something that is advocated to many of us as we are, especially in like the higher education realm. I think it's advocated in terms of being able to blend and wanting to have a seat at the table. You got to look a certain way, you got to speak a certain way. So you just dropped some gems, man.
And everyone covers. 55% of white straight men cover in the workplace. 80% of Black women cover in the workplace. You have 75% of Hispanic women cover in the workplace. 85% of women cover in the workplace. Women cover their giftings all the time, right? I remember a leader I had told one of an individual who was on the team as a woman, he was like, sometimes you need to tone down your 10s into a 7, right? And obviously he felt intimidated by her presence, but I'm like, don't tone them down unless you choose to tone down. You know, sometimes there's a benefit in that, right? You can't take every shot. Sometimes it's good to pass the ball to other people so they can develop and grow. But for the most part though, if you're particularly great in a particular area, be great, don't tone that down. Be great at what you do. And so covering happens all the time in the workplace. We code switch and we feel like, and a part of it is, you know, as people of color, if we want to be successful, we've been told that we need to navigate through white culture. That white culture doesn't have to navigate through people of color's world or neighborhoods to be successful, at least in the United States of America. But every time we cover it, there's a little bit of ourselves that we deny and that we minimize, and it ends up into resentment. And so I think it's really our responsibility to create environments where people don't have to cover. And I say, hey, only one can determine how much of themselves they want to bring into the world of work or to this university. I think it's the university's responsibility to create an environment that you can bring as much as you like. Now, if there's certain aspects of your identity that you want to keep at the door, that's your prerogative, and that's okay. But I do think it's our responsibility as institutional leaders to create an environment where people can bring as much as their identity that they can like, that is safe and that doesn't put other people in harm.
What's interesting is in the higher education sector, as professionals, like staff members, we are encouraged to encourage students to be themselves. But when you become a professional, it's not the same courtesy. So it's always this complex of teaching students how to be themselves. I'm allowing them to completely be themselves. You can come to class with orange hair, red hair, green hair, blue hair, but that's as a student. When you become a professional, now you need straight hair and keep it neutral and things of that nature. So it's definitely a very interesting path that, you know, we look at. And even when we talk about corporate, like there literally has been a corporate look. And even when you think about the military, like the military is still having conversations about, braids and Black women's hair and locks and the whole nine. So love your perspectives. Again, I see why you make the big bucks.
Oh, and can I just even elaborate? There's every organization has values, and then they have invisible values. And that's where it becomes tricky, because there's invisible values we're walking into, and that sometimes they contrast against the public values that they talk about. So in the workplace, one of the core values you see at a lot of workplaces is work-life balance, that we want to make sure that our employees have work-life balance. But a lot of managers grew up in the old guard, which means you're the first one in and the last one to leave, right? And so a person is saying, hey, I want to get promoted, but I take a lot of time off. Well, because the company says we want you to have a work-life balance. But my manager has an invisible value of you needing to be the first one here and the last one to leave. And unless you're doing that, I don't see you in a position as a manager. And I think it's this invisible values that get a lot of people in trouble, or really that hurts people's experiences at a workplace, because they've been told one thing in orientation, but the manager has another invisible value that they're being measured against, which is so unfair. And so you're absolutely right. And I think you see those invisible values in academia too. But I often say culture is not just something that we assimilate to, but it's something we have the responsibility to create. In every generation, we get pioneers who push the limits. And I'm so thankful for those pioneers, because what is professional? Who gets to define that? Yeah. We need to take a step back and say, who are actually defining what professionalism looks like? What predominant ethnicity is defining that? What predominant gender is defining that, right? What predominant sexual orientation is defining that? And when we start collecting that data, what we will start seeing is it's just a particular group making the rules for everyone else.
Yeah. When you talk about mentorship, do you have any mentors of color that you feel like from high school to now in your career have really helped create a trajectory for you, or even like a mental mindset that just opened doors for you?
Yes, some of those people are real people. Some of those people, invisible people that I've become real close to in books. They're my mentor and they don't even know it. And some of that is through video, but on deck. I feel like if you're able to get counseling and have mentors, that's something that I'm always in rotation in. There's things that I've experienced in my life as a person of color that has created trauma that other people don't understand. And so counseling is so good because it creates a safe space for me to talk those things out. It helps me peel back those limiting beliefs that I have about myself, particularly in business. And then the mentorship is very, very important, because I feel like what has been really, really helpful for me is people can teach you how to be successful, but a lot of people can't teach you how to stay successful. And anyone can make money, right? Not everyone can make a lot of money legally. Right? And to do the right thing. And particularly when it comes to taxes, and there's tax loopholes that are legal and that we can use for our benefit. But there are also illegal tax loopholes, right? And it doesn't mean that you need to be selling drugs on the corner. Like, you can find yourself in trouble in corporate America too, right? And so whatever environment that you find yourself in, I think the most important thing is not necessarily what you're doing, but who do you want to be? And you got to ask yourself that really early in life. What kind of person I want to be? Because it will really determine your success and how you handle success and how you treat people when the money starts coming in, you know? And so I just never wanted to be that individual where I got the money, but then fell into scandal because I didn't follow integrity, or I didn't have people around my life who knew me, who loved me, who could check me. Hey, Trevor, you're going down the wrong road. And so for me, the mentorship really helps me understand not necessarily just what I want to do in life, but it really helps me understand who I want to be in life and what kind of man, father, future husband, leader, community leader that I want to be.
Awesome. Let's talk about Unfiltered Conversations.
Let's talk about it. Let's do it.
Was there an incident that led you to start Unfiltered Conversations?
Yes. Typically, I feel like it was always in my mind, but 2016 president election, with everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, majority of people. And then when we woke up and Donald Trump became the president, I think that was a shock for a lot of people. And then that was nothing wrong that he became the president. But I think what happened is people with social media, particularly in 2016, I started to realize that you can work next to someone and never know what they believe on a particular issue like politics, but you were friends with them on social media and they would say these outrageous things that they never would have the confidence or the courage to say in your face. And I realized that there are certain particular subjects that people are scared to talk about. And reason why is, I often say, my counselor says that most people tell 90% of the truth. How do we get to that last 10%? And there's a fear of rejection, that if people really knew what we believed about a particular subject, they wouldn't want to be our friends. There's a fear of being fact-checked. When it talks about black on black crime or white on white crime, and you start showing people the facts, they don't want to be fact-checked, and so they stay in the conversation. There's a fear of covering, and we avoid these conversations. And another one, there's a fear of our own emotional responses. And it's not that people want to avoid these conversations because they don't have anything to say. They have a lot to say. They avoid the retaliation of these conversations. And so I just wanted to create a space where people could seek to hear and not just be heard.
Yeah.
If that makes sense, that we can get to that last 10% of the truth, and that there was things that we've been told, some of them are true, some of them are untrue. And so on the things that are untrue, how do we unlearn together? And, what I realized that a lot of people were hungry for it. It started as 5 people and then it jumped up to 200 people in one room. And it was just one of those things that I was pursuing my passion. I was really intrigued by this. I wanted to learn for myself. And because I wanted to learn, I realized that there was probably 10 other people who wanted to learn too. And when I realized there was 2,000 other people who wanted to learn, and it just became a beautiful thing.
So did they start off as meetings and then you created a podcast, or which came first?
They just started as me creating a meeting and writing 10 questions down. And it really wasn't starting on race. It was really starting on polarizing topics. And so we talked about taboo, polarizing things that people didn't want to talk about. So one was race. One was sexuality and sexual orientation. Another one was women in leadership. Another one was gentrification. These things that people were kind of wrestling in the community and they wanted answers. And so, but oftentimes we try to figure these things out alone. And so again, if you go back to the puzzle analogy, we can solve a puzzle a lot faster together than individually. And so how do we have these collective conversations that give multiple perspectives? And then from there, you can deduce your own viewpoints and opinions based on people's life stories and then research at the same time. And so I would have 10 questions in a jar. A person will pick out the question and then we will talk about it and keep doing that till we answer those questions.
Now, who were the participants? Was this something you did at church? Was this something that was just a free-for-all? Anybody in the community could come? Was it something you did on social media? Well, you said people picked something out of a jar, so I suppose it had to be a physical meeting.
It was a physical meeting. I initially started from church. Just some friends I invited over to my house for dinner. And 5 people showed up. It was a great conversation. The next thing we did was 15. And then the next one we opened it to a larger group. I often say refine your things. The smaller, the better. I think our natural temptation is we want big because we want people to see what we're doing. But it's in the mundane smallness where you can refine. And so I did a lot of these small ones for a while, probably for like 7 to 10 times. And then after I got a routine and feedback from people, what would make this more effectual? What would make this more beneficial? What are some better takeaways? By the 10th one, then I started to do larger crowds that end up being 120 to 200 people. And then I was like, you know what, that people wanted to extend the conversation. And so for a greater reach, there were a lot of people who couldn't be a part of the conversation, but they wanted insight on particular issues. I started a podcast. And so what became a little challenging with the podcast is I didn't want it just to be my perspective, even though my perspective is valid, but I try to incorporate people's stories. different points of views. I always say you don't know what you believe until you're able to argue the other side. And so anytime I'm arguing a point, I make sure I argue the other point, because I think you need to holistically experience empathy. And empathy is really putting yourself in someone else's shoes, even if you don't agree with it, right? And so, and that's what we saw when the civil rights movement is. What started the change is when people started to see it on the TVs, and many white Americans started to say, "Hey, would I want my child hosed down in the middle of the street? No." Or, man, what about if my child wanted to eat a sandwich at a lunch counter or go to a hospital and they were refused because of the color of the skin? One of the things that was really, really impactful for me, I never told this, but my mom's story. My mom, when she was a 5-year-old girl, she couldn't go into the shoe store to buy a pair of shoes because if a Black person put their foot in the shoes, then the white shoppers wouldn't want the shoe. So my grandmother would have to measure her shoe with a yarn. And then she would have to walk downtown with her sister, my aunt, and give the shoe owner the yarn. And then he would give her a shoe that was similar to that size, whether it fit or not. Because once you put the foot in the shoe, you can't give it back.
Wow.
Right. And so, like, my mom was born in 55. So this is the early 60s as it was going on, and that's our parents or our grandparents' generation, And so it's things like that where a lot of times people think we're in a post-racist society, but my mom experienced these things firsthand. And so unless you hear those stories, you think everything is peaches and cream, right? And I think it's so important that we create spaces where not only we share facts, but we tell stories, because it's really stories that create empathy. I can read something in the book and it not move me, but if you told me that someone is treating you differently because of your gender, and that someone's putting you in a box because they don't think they see women leadership and male leadership two different things, then I need to do something about that. I can't look away from you and say that you're my friend. And so the more times we can get people in spaces to hear each other's stories, the more change we see.
Awesome. Let's see. You nailed it.
I didn't know I was being graded, but I will take accreditation.
All right. So final question. How has your organization's Unfiltered Conversations changed your point of view on any issue? So with all of the meetings and the conversations you were having with people, how did those things, did any of those things change your point of view on any topics?
Absolutely. One of those topics is immigration. I think oftentimes immigration is really particularly a touchy situation in America. Also being pro-life and being pro-choice, those two things can I speak on. The thing about immigration, oftentimes I think when we look at it in the US, when immigration is talked about from the Mexico, Latin America, US border versus the Canadian US border, one is really more talked in a derogatory sense with the Mexican, Latin American, US border than the Canadian US border, right? But illegal immigration is happening in both areas. Drug smuggling and trafficking is happening in both areas, right? But we often only think about it from a derogatory sense from the southern border, right? Now, every sovereignty, every country has a right to protect their borders. That's just not the US. That's around the world. If you're connected to another country, you will experience immigration. One of the problems, though, in America is something called American exceptionalism, that we think that we do things and everything the best. And if we don't get it right, the rest of the world won't get it right. But that's not true, right? The second thing is oftentimes we make immigration about race and racism. But the more I travel around the world, particularly when I travel to Tanzania and Kenya, and then Uganda and Sudan, the Kenyans are frustrated with the Sudanese coming into Kenya illegally, right? Now, these are African people, both African countries bordered to one another. And so when we look at the US immigration issue, oftentimes we center it around race. But if you go around the world and you see another country who's bordered with someone who feels like there's an immigration problem, oftentimes it's not always centered around race. And so even race is a really particular touchy subject for America because it's our original sin that we never dealt with. But I think our natural propensity is to throw the race card. at every situation. And it's not always just that. It's a big part of it, but it's not always just that. And so as an African American, my trauma is real, but because my trauma has never really been acknowledged, I always bring it into the equation. And so sometimes I have to self-check my trauma, because every situation may not be a racially motivated situation, even though that has been the vast majority of experiences I've experienced in my life. The second thing I would say is, I often say everyone has a voice, but understand your primary and your secondary voice. Your primary voice is when you have opinions about a particular issue with firsthand experience. Your secondary voice is when you have opinions, but you lack experience, right? And when it comes to being pro-choice or pro-life, one of the things I often recommend is everyone has a voice. You can have an opinion, but because I'm not delivering children, I've just kind of said to myself, it's not that I don't have an opinion about it, but this needs to be a secondary voice conversation for me as a man. And the women who are pro-choice versus the women who are pro-life, that they should lead the conversation. And I'm going to take a step back. It's not, again, that I don't have an opinion, but because I lack firsthand experience, that I really want to stay in that secondary voice. And this is how it helps me become an ally, right? Because oftentimes the problem people get into is they start speaking in their primary voice with secondary voice experiences. And so, for example, the Black community needs to do this. Well, have you ever lived in the Black community? No. So you have a secondary voice. So take your secondary voice tail out this conversation, right? And so I think when we want to be an ally is really about knowing when to speak. And it's about, again, not how I see you, but how you want to be seen and how you want me to show up for you. And even if I don't agree with everything, I still can be an ally. And one of the reasons why I say that is married couples don't agree on everything.
True.
And they still learn how to navigate and function and have a successful relationship. So why can't we, whether I'm pro-choice or pro-life, why can I learn how to agree on the things that we agree on, and so I can still be an ally to someone that I may disagree with?
Trevor, I just want to say thank you so much. I know I have walked away from this conversation with some gems. I know my students will walk away from this conversation with some gems. So you are the man. This has been phenomenal.
I'm only as good as the people I hang around with. And we've been friends for a few decades now. And so any successes you think you see in me, you're responsible for a portion of it. And so I thank you, Lauren, for being not only a self-learner, but literally when I think about the word loyalty, if there was a face or a picture to it, they should put Lauren's face in the dictionary on it, because truly.
I just want to say, I want my students to know I go to Trevor for financial advice. He thinks I don't listen. I don't listen immediately when he's talking. I'm hard-headed, but I take notes and I listen. So always make sure you have people in your corner who are more knowledgeable than you. I truly believe if you are the smartest person in the room, you are in the wrong room. And so I always try to keep a lot of diversity around me, diverse thought, diverse careers, and just people who have access that I don't have, information that I don't have, because I'm a lifetime learner.
100%. And I don't even think it's hard-headed. You're just thorough. It needs to make sense to you.
Yeah. All right, give me 1 second.